Humans have always liked scary stories, whether that's passing down little myths and legends, or whether that's sitting around a campfire telling a spooky saga. We love them. Ancient mythology always includes violence and the scary material that makes us go, ooh. I mean, have you read Greek mythology recently? And since we have in fact evolved from being monkeys, we have new technologies that have evolved with us, including horror movies. So why do we like horror movies and general other horror media? Let's take a look into the human psychology of horror. The first thing that we're going to have to do is look at the different parts of our neurology, our brain, to see which parts are relevant when taking in stimuli. The first one is the thalamus, and this determines where incoming sensory data should be sent to the body. The second part of the brain is the sensory cortex, and this interprets the sensory data sent. The role of the hippocampus is to store and retrieve memories, and then it processes the stimuli sent. The amygdala determines possible threats and decodes emotions, and it also stores memories, so it can remember certain threats. And the hypothalamus, more specifically in the case of talking about horror, will be here to activate the fight or flight response. What is the fight or flight response? The fight or flight response is two separate ways in which humans can respond to threats or stress. They can either face it full on or they can run away. It's a survival instinct used to help us, not get killed by boars in the wild. The first thing that happens is a instigating event, the threat, which can be attack, harm, or a threat to survival. When our sensory organs, for example our eyes or ears, pick up stimuli that may be a threat, it activates two separate parts of the brain, the amygdala and the hypothalamus. In return, the ACTH is activated. This is the pituitary gland, and it secretes adrenocorticotropic hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormones include the two hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, and this starts the fight or flight response, which includes physical effects. These effects can be an increase in heart rate, tunnel vision, shaking, and dilated pupils. However, it is argued that the brain can process and register what is real and what isn't, and therefore the adrenaline released will subside after the original horror event, so we can enjoy the energy. But according to G. Sparks, PhD, only about 10% of us actually enjoy the adrenaline rush. It can't be purely biologically and neurologically based if only around 10% of us actually enjoy it. So there have to be other factors as to why people watch horror movies. G. Walters identified 3 primary factors as to why people enjoy horror material. The first is tension, the second is relevance, and the third is unrealism. The tension provides adequate entertainment for us as humans when watching these kinds of material. We can engage in it, as well as the relevance, whether or not we identify with the hero or possibly even the villain in some circumstances. And with unrealism, well, we know it's fake, so it's not going to harm us psychologically if we know it's not real. There are currently 8 different theories that can explain why we enjoy horror, the first being psychoanalytic, the second being catharsis, the third excitation transfer, 4 curiosity and fascination, 5 disposal and alignment theory, 6 sensation seeking scale, 7 gender socialization theory, and 8 societal fears. I won't be going through every single one on this list, but I will be going through 1, 2, 3, and 8. The first, of course, is psychoanalytic, which argues that horror films tap into primordial archetypes buried deep within our collective subconscious, and this was said by C. Jung. Humans were evolved to be quite violent beings. We had to be at the time because there were numerous threats to our survival. And in a sense, we still have those buried within our subconsciousness. And it can be quite cathartic to watch things play out in front of us instead of having to resort to the violence ourselves. And this is wherein psychoanalytic and catharsis can be very much interlinked as one theory. Back in the day when we were hanging out in our caves and suddenly a bear or a lion or some historically accurate creature at the time would come upon us, we would have to club them to death. Or if another being of our own species decided to come along and steal our food or our mate, we would have to club them to death. It kind of was the only way back then. Actually, I think sometimes people still do that. And evolution doesn't mean we are getting rid of those characteristics, we are just evolving above them, apparently, with language and communication. You wouldn't believe it, would you? Those instincts are still there, and those instincts are very much present. So watching them be carried out in front of us may be very cathartic, and we can relate to them on a primordial level, and hopefully not do them ourselves. Yes? Can we agree on that? The next is excitation transfer, brought about by Kerr applying it to horror. It said that the excitation that we see on screen can be transferred over to us, a sense of catharsis in a way. C. Hoffner and K. Levine in 2005 did a meta-analysis published in Media Psychology of 35 journal articles regarding the relationship between viewer enjoyment and frightening movies, and the common theories they found were excitation transfer, individual empathy, for people who are less empathetic tend to enjoy horror movies more, which was what Tamborini said, and sensation seeking. On the other hand, D. Scow argued that horror films reflect our societal fears. They noted that in the 50s, mutants tended to reflect our fear of nuclear weaponry, and in the 60s, zombies became quite popular, possibly due to Vietnam. Nightmare on Elm Street reflected a mistrust of authority figures due to Watergate, and zombies have come back up in popularity due to a fear of viral pandemics. Some studies have gone into why individuals enjoy horror movies. I'm just saying for this first study I will be saying some quite graphic content. I'll put a timestamp when that part is over, but essentially if you don't want to hear what it was, college students were shown 3 different videos depicting real life horrors. So if you don't want to hear what those horrors were, the timestamp will be here. Okay, so Woodit, Macaulay and Rosin in 1994 did research on disgust and gore. They showed college students 3 documentary videos depicting real-life horrors. The first one were cows being stunned, killed and butchered, the second was a monkey being struck in the head with a hammer, and the third was a surgical video of a child's skin being turned inside out. 99% of their sample turned off the videos before they ended, but it was very strange that many of them would also pay to see a horror movie. Macaulay argued again that the fictional nature of horror movies allow viewers to have a sense of control over placing a psychological distance between them and the violent acts witnessed. D. Johnston in 1995 published a piece in the Human Communication Research paper. He took 220 US adolescents and wanted to see the different motivations they had for watching horror movies. He managed to find 4 different categories of types of people who watch horror movies. There were gore watchers, thrill watchers, independent watchers, and problem watchers. These categories were discussed in relation to dispositional characteristics such as fearfulness, empathy, and sensation seeking. And he found, quote, "The 4 viewing motivations are found to be related to viewers' cognitive and affective responses to horror films, as well as either the viewer's tendency to identify with the killers or the victims." With gore watchers, they tended to find lower empathy and higher sensation-seeking characteristics, and only among males a strong identification with the killer. Thrill watchers, on the other hand, tended to have high empathy and high sensation-seeking characteristics, and they identified more with the victims and liked the suspense. Independent watchers had high empathy for the victims and a high positive effect for overcoming the fear that they had. Problem watchers, on the other hand, had a high empathy for the victim, but were characterized by a negative effect. For example, they had a sense of helplessness. What about the monsters themselves. Monsters have always been a part of human mythology and legend, and they endure culturally, possibly because they, quote, press the right cognitive buttons. Boyer, as cited in Barrett 2000, says they fulfill a counterintuitive, attention-grabbing desire. For example, Moses and the burning bush. There was the burning bush, the bush in the Bible that was burning but wasn't dying. This is counterintuitive and it attention grabs. This is possibly why that part of the Bible is more well known than the other parts. Those parts of the Old Testament tend to be the ones that are most talked about. It's counterintuitive. And in the same way, zombies are dead, but they move. That's also counterintuitive, and it is attention grabbing. It's also worthy to note that a lot of monsters are physical manifestations of threats to survival. So many of them are humanoid, like zombies, like mummies, like vampires. They all take a somewhat human form. Let's take zombies, for example. They represent a fear of disease and infection, and possibly reflect a fear of losing control within humans. This could be derived from Haiti, where it was believed that dead family members returned, but in reality they were just mentally ill or they were brain damaged. On the other hand, if you look at things like vampires, they tend to have more of a sex appeal. They're monsters, they're non-human, but there seems to be something sexy about them. And people believe that this is because they allude to extreme sadomasochistic desires, for example, the biting and draining of blood. Vampires, on the other hand, may be a manifestation of more taboo sexual practices, and a fear of them in the biblical times, because sex? What's that? I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a small insight into the psychology of horror. I couldn't go through every single theory or every single theory in detail, but I hope there was at least a basic understanding of perhaps why do we like horror? Why? It's scary. Scary's meant to be negative, but we like it. Oh, the human brain. See you guys in the next one. Stay scary.